Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't losing someone you love, it's being forced to replace them before you've even had time to grieve. Eleanor Hartwell knows this pain all too well as she stands in a small frontier chapel about to marry a complete stranger just to keep her land. The territorial judge has given her no choice. Marry by month's end or lose everything. The only man willing is Jacob Crane, a quiet mountain man the town barely knows. Eleanor expects nothing from this arrangement except survival. But when Jacob opens a small wooden box at the altar, what's inside stops her heart. What could this silent stranger possibly give her that would change everything? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pocket watch lay cold in Eleanor Hartwell's palm, its hands frozen at 2:30, the exact moment Thomas had drawn his last breath beneath a collapsed pine tree 6 months ago. She turned it over slowly, reading the inscription she'd had engraved on their first anniversary. "Time stands still when I'm with you." The irony wasn't lost on her now. Time had indeed stopped, but not in the way either of them had imagined. Eleanor sat at the rough-hewn table in her cabin, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The cabin felt too large now, too empty, though it measured barely 20 feet square. Every corner held memories of Thomas, his coat still hanging by the door, his boots beneath the bed, the chair he'd made that winter when snow had kept them inside for 3 weeks straight. She hadn't moved any of it. Couldn't bring herself to pack away the physical evidence that he'd existed, that they'd built something here together, in this unforgiving Montana territory. Outside, Pine Ridge bustled with its usual commerce. She could hear the distant sounds of wagons creaking past, men calling to each other outside the saloon, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Life continued for everyone else. For Eleanor, it felt like she was watching the world through thick glass, separated from it all by grief so heavy it had become a physical weight. The knock at her door startled her. She tucked the watch into her apron pocket and stood, smoothing her black mourning dress. Through the window, she could see Judge Cornelius Wakefield standing on her small porch, his considerable bulk blocking most of the light. Her stomach tightened. The judge hadn't visited her since Thomas's funeral, and his presence never brought good news. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said when she opened the door, not waiting for an invitation before stepping inside. His eyes swept the cabin with proprietorial assessment. "We need to discuss your situation." Eleanor remained by the door, one hand still on the latch. "My situation, Judge?" "Your husband's debts." He removed his hat, turning it in, his thick fingers. "The logging company has presented claims. There's also the matter of property taxes, unpaid since last autumn, and the territorial statute regarding unaccompanied women on claimed land." She'd known this was coming. Thomas had mentioned debts, had worried about them in those final months, but he'd always said they'd find a way through. He'd been an optimist, her Thomas. Sometimes she wondered if that optimism had made him careless the day that tree fell. "I'm working on the debts," Eleanor said, though they both knew it was a thin pretense. "Mrs. McKenna has hired me for sewing, and I've been taking in laundry from— It won't be enough." Wakefield's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "The territorial law is clear, Mrs. Hartwell. A widow has 6 months to remarry or relinquish her claim. Your 6 months are nearly up. That's an old law, surely in cases where the law is the law." He placed his hat on her table, a gesture of settling in that made her skin crawl. "I've come here as a courtesy to inform you that I'm prepared to purchase your claim, fair price. Enough to see you safely to family back east, if you have any." Eleanor's jaw tightened. This wasn't courtesy. This was vulture behavior, circling what he assumed was a dying claim. The land wasn't much 40 acres of forest and rocky soil, but Thomas had loved it, had died for it, in a way. "I'm not selling." Wakefield's expression hardened. Then you have 2 weeks to find a husband, Mrs. Hartwell. If you fail to comply with territorial statute, I'll have no choice but to declare the claim abandoned and open it for new settlers." He picked up his hat. "I'm trying to help you here. A woman alone in this territory, it's not natural, not safe." After he left, Eleanor sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. 2 weeks. The deadline felt like a noose tightening around her throat. That evening, Sarah McKenna arrived with a basket of bread and preserves. Sarah was one of the few women in Pine Ridge who'd shown Eleanor genuine kindness since Thomas's death. A widow herself, she understood the peculiar isolation that came with losing a husband on the frontier. "I heard Wakefield paid you a visit," Sarah said, setting the basket on the table. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. "The whole town's heard by now. He's not exactly subtle." Eleanor poured them both coffee from the pot on the stove. "He wants my land." "Of course he does. Man's been buying up claims since he arrived 3 years ago. Calls it consolidation. Rest of us call it what it is, theft, dressed in legal language." Sarah accepted the cup, warming her hands around it. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "I can't remarry Sarah. It's only been 6 months. I still—" She touched the pocket watch through her apron. "I still love him." Sarah reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand with her own. "Love doesn't die just because a person does. Thomas wouldn't want you to lose everything he worked for because of some heartless law. But who would marry me? Even if I wanted to, which I don't. Who in this town would take on a grieving widow with nothing but debts and a timber claim?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "There's been talk," she said carefully, "about Jacob Crane." Eleanor frowned. "The mountain man? I've never even met him." "Not many have. He comes down from the high timber maybe once a month for supplies. Keeps to himself. But Reverend Dale mentioned that Jacob inquired about your situation after services last Sunday." "Inquired how?" "Asked if it was true about the judge's deadline. Asked if you had family. Asked," Sarah paused, choosing her words, "asked if you were the kind of woman who might consider a practical arrangement." Eleanor's chest tightened. A practical arrangement, as if marriage could ever be reduced to something so cold and transactional. "I don't know anything about him. None of us do, really. He's been here about 5 years, built himself a cabin up in the high country, trades furs, keeps his word, pays his bills. That's more than can be said for half the men in this territory." Sarah leaned forward. "There's a story about him happened 2 winters ago. The Patterson boy wandered off during a storm, would have frozen if Jacob hadn't found him. Carried that child 5 miles through waist-deep snow to get him home safe." Eleanor tried to picture this man, this stranger who might be her only lifeline. "What does he look like?" "Big, quiet, has a beard down to his chest and hair he keeps tied back, wears buckskin mostly, looks like he could wrestle a bear, and probably has." Sarah's expression softened. "I'm not saying it would be a love match, Eleanor, but it might be survival. And sometimes survival is all we can ask for." That night, Eleanor lay in bed. Listening to the wind rattle the cabin's shutters, she pulled Thomas's pillow close, breathing in the faint scent of him that still lingered in the fabric. The thought of another man in this cabin, in this bed, felt like a betrayal so profound it made her physically ill. But the alternative was losing everything. Losing the land Thomas had claimed. Losing the home they'd built together, being cast out into a world that had no place for women without men to vouch for them. She touched the pocket watch on the bedside table. "Tell me what to do," she whispered into the darkness. "Tell me if I'm meant to let go." The watch offered no answer. Time remained frozen at 2:30, and Eleanor remained frozen with it, caught between a past she couldn't release and a future she couldn't bear to face. 3 days later, Reverend Dale knocked on her door. He held a letter in his hand, sealed with wax. "It's from Jacob Crane," he said gently. "He asked me to deliver it personally. Wanted Want you to know it came from him, not from the judge or anyone else trying to influence your decision." Eleanor took the letter with trembling hands. After the Reverend left, she sat for a long time just holding it, afraid of what words might be inside. Finally, as the sun began to set, she broke the seal and read. The handwriting was surprisingly neat, the words carefully chosen. Jacob Crane, it seemed, was not an uneducated man. He offered marriage without conditions, offered protection and a home, offered to take on her debts and respect her mourning. He made no promises of affection, asked for nothing except that she consider his proposal honestly. At the bottom, he'd written one line that undid her. A woman shouldn't have to lose twice in one lifetime. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it beside Thomas's pocket watch. Then she sat at her table, took out a piece of paper, and began to write her answer. Eleanor's acceptance letter was brief. She couldn't bring herself to write more than necessary, a simple yes, an acknowledgement of his terms, and a request to meet before any formal arrangements were made. She gave the sealed envelope to Reverend Dale the next morning, her hands steady despite the tumult in her chest. "You're making a practical choice," the Reverend said, his weathered face kind. "The Lord provides in unexpected ways, Mrs. Hartwell. Sometimes he sends us help in forms we don't recognize at first. She wasn't sure about divine providence, but she knew about desperation. That would have to be enough." 2 days passed before she received word that Jacob Crane would meet her at the general store on Saturday afternoon. The store was neutral ground, public enough to be proper, but not so crowded as to make conversation impossible. Eleanor spent Friday night altering her black dress, taking in the waist that had grown loose during months of grief-dampened appetite. She wanted to look presentable, even if this was merely a transaction. Saturday arrived cold and bright. Eleanor walked the rutted main street of Pine Ridge with her shawl pulled tight, aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. News of Jacob's proposal had spread. Nothing stayed secret long in a town of fewer than 300 souls. She could feel the weight of judgment and curiosity following her like a shadow. The general store smelled of coffee, leather, and the sawdust scattered across the floor. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, nodded to her from behind the counter but said nothing. In the back corner, near the pot-bellied stove, a man stood with his back to her. He was, indeed, big, as Sarah had said, tall enough that he had to duck slightly beneath the hanging lanterns, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of hard physical labor. His hair was dark, pulled back and tied with a leather cord, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite its length. He wore buckskin trousers and a wool shirt that had seen better days but was clean. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, Eleanor's first thought was that his eyes were kind. Brown and deep-set beneath heavy brows, they held a steadiness that immediately steadied her own racing heart. He didn't smile, didn't seem the type who smiled easily, but he nodded with a respect that felt genuine. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. His voice was low, barely above a rumble, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Something Eastern, refined, hidden beneath years of frontier life. "Mr. Crane." She clasped her hands in front of her, willing them not to shake. "I'm grateful you agreed to meet." He gestured to 2 chairs near the stove. "Thought we should talk plainly before any decisions are made final." They sat, the stove's warmth a welcome buffer against the autumn chill seeping through the store's walls. For a moment, neither spoke. Eleanor studied him covertly, the calluses on his hands, the scar along his jawline, the way he held himself with a quiet self-containment that suggested comfort with solitude. "I want you to know," Jacob began, his gaze direct, "that I'm not looking to take advantage of your circumstances. The Reverend told me about the judge's deadline, about your husband's debts. I have the means to help, and I'm willing to do so. Why?" The question came out sharper than Eleanor intended. "You don't know me. Why would you bind yourself to a stranger's problems?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his fingers laced together. "5 years ago, when I first came to this territory, I was lost, not just in direction, lost in myself. I'd left behind everything I knew, everyone who knew me. Came out here thinking solitude would be a refuge. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It was, but it also became a kind of prison. I built my life around silence, around distance from people. It's taken me this long to realize that's not living, that's just existing. Eleanor listened, surprised by his candor. She'd expected a rough man with rough words, not this measured honesty. When I heard about your situation, Jacob continued, I thought maybe we could help each other. You need protection from the judge's machinations. He hesitated, I need to remember how to be part of the world again. A marriage of convenience, yes, but one built on mutual respect. I won't make demands on you beyond what you're willing to give. And what are you willing to give? Eleanor asked. A home, safety, my name, and whatever legal protection that provides. Time to grieve without someone like Wakefield breathing down your neck. He met her eyes steadily. I won't ask you to pretend to feel something you don't. Won't expect you to forget your husband or play at being a loving wife. Just partnership. Two people helping each other through difficult circumstances. It was the most practical proposal Eleanor could imagine, and yet something in his tone suggested layers beneath the practical words. She thought of his letter, that final line about not losing twice. You understand I'm still in mourning, she said, that I loved my husband very much. I do. And you're comfortable with a marriage that may never become more than an arrangement on paper? Jacob's expression flickered something that might have been sadness or resignation. I've been alone a long time, Mrs. Hartwell. Having company, even company that doesn't love me, would be more than I've had in years. If that's all this ever becomes, I'll count it as improvement. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, not attraction, not yet, but a recognition of shared loneliness. This man understood loss in his own way. He wasn't asking her to heal or move on. He was simply offering a lifeline and asking for a kind of companionship in return. What do people say about you? She asked. In town, I mean. I've heard stories, but I don't know what's true. A hint of amusement touched his eyes. They say I'm more bear than man, that I killed a Nard grizzly with my bare hands, which isn't true, I used a knife. They say I'm hiding from something back east, which is true, though not in the criminal sense. They say I'm dangerous. He paused. I'm not dangerous to anyone who doesn't mean harm. But I won't lie and say I'm a gentle man. The mountains don't make gentlemen. The Patterson boy, Eleanor said, the one you saved from the storm. Is that true? It's true. Boy was 8 years old, wandered off chasing his dog, found him half frozen in a ravine. Did what anyone would do. Most people wouldn't have been out in that storm in the first place. Jacob shrugged. I don't mind storms. They talked for another hour. Jacob told her about his cabin in the high timber, about the life she could expect there. Isolated, yes, but with everything needed for comfort. He trapped and hunted, sold furs in town, and kept a small garden in summer. He had books, a detail that surprised her, and could read and write better than most men. She'd met. He'd had education once, back in Philadelphia, before circumstances had driven him west. Eleanor told him about Thomas, about their 3 years of marriage, about the dreams they'd had for the homestead. Jacob listened without interruption, without offering platitudes or trying to minimize her grief. When she cried sudden tears she hadn't expected, he simply handed her his handkerchief and waited quietly until she'd composed herself. I need time, Eleanor said finally, to think about this, to make my peace with it. How much time do you have before the judge's deadline? 12 days, Jacob nodded. Then take 11 of them. If you decide yes, send word to me through the Reverend. We can marry quickly, no need for fanfare or fuss. If you decide no, I'll respect that too. But Mrs. Hartwell, he leaned forward slightly, Don't let fear of dishonoring your husband's memory make you lose everything he worked to give you. Sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to keep living. They stood. Jacob offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor shook it. His grip was firm but careful, mindful of her smaller hand. As she walked home through the lengthening shadows, Eleanor felt the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned, about the children they'd hoped to have. She thought about Jacob Crane, this strange, solitary man who'd offered her a way forward without asking her to forget the past. That night, she took out Thomas's pocket watch one more time. She held it to her ear, listening to the silence where ticking should have been. Time had stopped for Thomas, but perhaps she thought it didn't have to stop for her. On the 11th day, Eleanor sent her answer to Jacob Crane. The wedding was set for the following Saturday, 2 weeks after their meeting at the general store. Judge Wakefield would have his marriage, but it would be on Eleanor's terms, with a man of her choosing. Even if that man was still a mystery she had yet to understand, the journey to Jacob's cabin took the better part of the afternoon. The wagon climbed steadily through dense pine forest, following a narrow track that showed little evidence of regular use. Eleanor sat in silence, watching the world change around her. The valley fell away behind them, Pine Ridge shrinking to a scattering of buildings barely visible through the trees. The air grew thinner, colder, sharper, with the scent of pine and approaching winter. Jacob drove with practiced ease, his attention on the trail ahead. He didn't attempt conversation, seeming to understand that Eleanor needed time to process what had just happened, what she'd just committed to. Occasionally he would point out a landmark, a distinctive rock formation, a creek crossing, a lightning-struck tree, small navigational markers that meant nothing to Eleanor but clearly charted his world. As they climbed higher, the forest thickened. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches filtering the grey light into something dim and cathedral-like. Eleanor had never been this far into the mountains. Thomas's logging claim had been in the lower timber, accessible and relatively gentle. This was different. This was wilderness in a way that made her feel very small and very far from everything she'd known. "How much farther?" she asked finally, more to break the silence than from any real need to know. "Another hour?" Jacob said. "Road gets rougher from here. Hold on to the bench." He wasn't exaggerating. The track became little more than a suggestion, winding between massive tree trunks and overexposed roots that made the wagon lurch and sway. Eleanor gripped the bench, her wedding dress gathering more mud with each jolt. The ivory silk was ruined now, but she found she didn't care. It had served its purpose. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a small clearing where the forest briefly relented. Eleanor's first impression was of solid competence. The structure was larger than she'd expected, a main room with a loft above, a smaller, attached room that might be a bedroom, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The logs were chinked tight against weather, the roof was cedar shake, and smoke rose from a stone chimney. Someone had built this place to last. Jacob helped her down from the wagon, and Eleanor stood in the clearing, turning slowly to take it all in. Behind the cabin, the forest pressed close, but in front, the land opened up slightly. She could see a small garden plot, now dormant for winter, and what looked like a smokehouse. Beyond that, the land dropped away, offering a view down the valley that was breathtaking even under grey skies. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, and meant it. Jacob looked pleased, a slight relaxation of his usually guarded expression. "Been working on it 5 years now. Still things to improve, but it's solid. Warm in winter, cool in summer." He gestured toward the door. "Want to see inside?" The interior was dim after the brightness outside, but as Eleanor's eyes adjusted, she was struck by how tidy everything was. This wasn't the bachelor hovel she'd half expected. The main room held a table and chairs, a large stone fireplace with a cooking crane, shelves lined with supplies and, surprisingly, books, many books. The floor was clean swept plank, covered here and there with thick furs. Windows on 2 walls let in what light the afternoon offered. "Bedrooms through there," Jacob said, indicating a door to the left. "That's yours. I sleep in the loft." He pointed to a ladder leading to the space above. "Gives us both privacy." Eleanor walked to the bedroom door and looked inside. It was small but complete, a bed with a thick quilt, a washstand, a chest for clothes, hooks on the wall for hanging things. A window looked out onto the forest. Someone had made an effort here. The room felt prepared, intentional, like Jacob had been expecting her. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. Traded for some things, the glass for the windows, the iron for the stove. But the structure, yeah, that was me." He moved to the fireplace and began building up the fire that had been banked low. "I'll bring in your trunk. You can settle in while I tend to the horses." Jacob left her alone, and Eleanor stood in the center of the main room, trying to understand this new reality. This was home now. Not the cabin she'd shared with Thomas, not the familiar streets of Pine Ridge, but this place carved out of wilderness by a man she'd married hours ago. She walked to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. Dickens, as Jacob had mentioned. Also Thoreau, Emerson, Shakespeare, a worn Bible, books on natural history, even a volume of poetry. These weren't the books of an uneducated mountain man. These were the books of someone who valued learning, who needed more than physical survival to feel truly alive. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a violin case. Eleanor remembered Jacob mentioning it during their conversation at the store. She didn't open it, but she wondered about it, about the story behind a mountain man who read philosophy and owned an instrument he didn't play. When Jacob returned with her trunk, he found her standing by the bookshelf. "You're welcome to any of them," he said. "Gets long up here in winter. Books. Help pass the time." "Where did you get them all?" "Brought some from back east. Traded for others. Man who trapped these mountains before me left a few when he moved on." Jacob set the trunk down in the bedroom doorway. "I'll let you get settled. Figure you'll want to change out of that dress before it's completely ruined." Eleanor looked down at the mud-spattered silk and almost laughed. "It's already ruined. But yes, I'd like to change." Jacob nodded and retreated to give her privacy. Eleanor carried her trunk into the bedroom and closed the door. She unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses on the wall hooks, placing her brush and hand mirror on the washstand, setting Thomas's pocket watch carefully on the small table beside the bed. The room gradually took on her presence, though it still felt borrowed, temporary. When she emerged in a simple wool dress more appropriate for mountain life, she found Jacob had made coffee and set out bread and cheese on the table. They ate together in careful silence, 2 strangers performing the ritual of a shared meal. The coffee was strong and good, the bread fresh enough to suggest he'd baked recently. "There's a routine here," Jacob said after they'd eaten. "I check the traplines most days. Sometimes I'm gone overnight, if I go down to the lower elevations. There's a root cellar stocked for winter. Smokehouse has meat, chickens in the coop behind the cabin for eggs. Garden's done for the season, but we'll need planting come spring." He paused. "I'm not expecting you to do all the domestic work. We'll share what needs doing." Eleanor nodded, appreciating that he was setting expectations, giving her information to orient herself. "What about winter? Are we snowed in?" "Can be. Usually the road stays passable until January, then we're mostly here until March thaw. I've got enough supplies stored that we won't starve, and if you're careful, there's enough of everything." He looked at her directly. "It's isolated, Eleanor. Sometimes weeks without seeing another soul. If that's going to be a problem, we should know now." Eleanor thought about Pine Ridge, about the gossip and judgment, about Judge Wakefield's smug face. "I think I'll manage," she said quietly. That first night, Eleanor lay in her unfamiliar bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a cabin that creaked and settled differently than the one she'd left behind. Through the bedroom door, she could hear Jacob moving quietly in the loft, the sound of boots being removed, the rustle of blankets. Then, silence. She touched the pine ring on her finger, then reached for Thomas's pocket watch on the bedside table. The two objects felt connected somehow, past and present, loss and continuation. She was Eleanor Crane now, living in a mountain cabin with a man who'd carved her wedding ring from her dead husband's trees. It should have felt wrong, but lying there in the darkness, listening to the wind in the pines outside, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safe. Not happy, not yet, but safe. And for now, that was more than enough. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Eleanor hadn't expected. Life in the mountains had its own cadence, measured not by clock hands, but by the sun's arc and the tasks that filled each day. She woke to find Jacob already up, coffee warming on the stove, the fire built high against the morning chill. They'd share a simple breakfast oatmeal, eggs from the chickens, sometimes bacon from the smokehouse, and then Jacob would head out to check his traplines or work on the endless maintenance a mountain homestead required. Eleanor took charge of the domestic sphere, though Jacob had been right that he didn't expect her to shoulder it all alone. They worked together in an unspoken partnership. He'd haul water from the spring, she'd heat it for washing. He'd dress the game he caught, she'd prepare it for cooking or smoking. He'd chop firewood, she'd stack it, two people making a life together through necessity, with respect taking the place of affection. But as October gave way to November, something shifted. Not dramatically, there was no single moment Eleanor could point to, but gradually, like the changing of seasons, she began to notice small details about Jacob that complicated her understanding of him. The way he'd leave wildflowers on the table when he returned from the traplines, never mentioned, just there. The careful way he'd mended a tear in her dress when he thought he wasn't looking. How he'd always serve her coffee first, always wait to make sure she had enough before taking his own portion. One evening, Eleanor discovered Jacob could read aloud beautifully. She'd been struggling with a passage in one of his Dickens novels, and he'd offered to read it to her. His voice transformed the words, bringing characters to life with subtle changes in tone and pacing. They fell into a routine after that evening spent with Jacob reading, while Eleanor mended or knitted, the fire crackling between them. "Where did you learn to read like that?" she asked one night, setting aside her needlework. Jacob closed the book, marking his place with a leather cord. "My mother was a teacher back in Philadelphia. She believed in education, in the power of words, insisted. I learned to read well, to speak properly, to understand literature and philosophy." A shadow crossed his face. "She died when I was 17, consumption." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. "It was a long time ago." Jacob stared into the fire. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said a person's worth was measured by their resilience, by how they handled hardship." It was the most personal thing Jacob had shared since their wedding, and Eleanor felt honored to receive it. "What about your father?" "He remarried within the year. A woman who had no patience for a grown son, who reminded her that she wasn't his first wife." Jacob's voice held no bitterness, just statement of fact. "I left soon after. Headed west, found work where I could. Eventually ended up here." Eleanor wanted to ask more. Why here? Why alone? Why this particular piece of wilderness? But she sensed Jacob had reached his limit for confessions. She returned to her knitting, and after a moment, he resumed reading. Later that week, Eleanor made a discovery that changed her understanding of Jacob entirely. She'd been looking for extra blankets in the storage area beneath the loft, and found instead workshop. Not the rough space of practical repairs, but something more a craftsman's domain. There were tools arranged with precision, half-finished carvings in various stages of completion, and detailed sketches pinned to the wall. Jacob found her there, standing among the evidence of his hidden artistry. "I should have mentioned that space," he said, not quite apologetic. Eleanor held up one of the carvings, a bird captured mid-flight, so delicate and lifelike she half expected it to take wing from her palm. "Jacob, these are extraordinary." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just something to do in winter. Keeps my hands busy." "This is more than busy work." She set down the bird carefully. "This is art." "Art doesn't have much place in mountain living," Jacob said, but Eleanor could see he was pleased by her recognition. She picked up another, carving a doe, head raised, alert and graceful. "You see beauty in things, that's rare." Jacob met her eyes, and for a moment something passed between them that was more than courtesy, more than careful friendship. "So do you," he said quietly. "You just haven't let yourself notice it lately." That night, Eleanor lay awake thinking about Jacob's words. When had she stopped seeing beauty? The sunset over Pine Ridge, the way frost decorated windows, the first snowfall of winter, these things still happened, but she'd been too locked in grief to notice them. Thomas had loved beauty, had pointed it out constantly. Would he want her to spend the rest of her life blind to it? The next morning, she woke to find it had snowed during the night. The world outside was transformed, muffled and clean. Jacob was already outside, clearing a path to the woodshed, his breath visible in the cold air. Eleanor stood at the window watching him work, noting the efficiency of his movements, the strength in his shoulders, the occasional pause to look out at the snow-covered forest with what she recognized now as appreciation. When he came inside, stamping snow from his boots, Eleanor had coffee and breakfast ready. "It's beautiful out there," she said. Jacob looked at her in surprise, then smiled a real smile, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines carved by years of solitude. "It is," he agreed. "First snow always feels like a promise. That winter will be hard, but the world will come back beautiful in spring." They ate breakfast together, and Eleanor realized she was no longer forcing herself through the motions of their shared life. Something had eased, opened up. She wasn't in love with Jacob Crane, she was still too bound to Thomas's memory for that, but she was beginning to like him, to appreciate his quiet steadiness, his unexpected depths, his capacity for gentleness despite his rough exterior. That afternoon, while Jacob was out checking snares, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in months. She took out paper and pen and wrote to Sarah, telling her about the mountain, the cabin, the simple rhythms of this new life, and about Jacob, how he read Dickens with the skill of an actor, how he carved birds that looked ready to fly, how he left wildflowers on the table without comment. She signed the letter Eleanor Crane and realized that for the first time the name didn't feel entirely borrowed. December came with heavy snows that closed the mountain road completely. Eleanor and Jacob were truly isolated now, dependent entirely on each other and the supplies Jacob had laid in. Rather than feeling trapped, Eleanor found the isolation oddly peaceful. With no possibility of visitors or trips to town, she could simply exist without the weight of judgment or expectation. One afternoon, while Jacob was out snowshoeing to check his father's trapline, Eleanor decided to thoroughly clean the bedroom. She'd been living there for nearly 2 months, but had never done more than basic tidying. Now, with time and energy to spare, she stripped the bed, swept the floors, and washed the window until it gleamed. While moving the small bedside table to clean behind it, she heard something rattle inside the drawer. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with string, some papers that looked official, and at the bottom a pocket watch. Eleanor's heart stopped. She recognized that watch instantly, the silver case, with its distinctive engraving, the fob chain her mother had given Thomas as a wedding gift. Her hands trembled as she lifted it from the drawer. It was Thomas's watch, the one he'd been carrying the day he died, the one she thought had been lost or taken by whoever had found his body. Beneath the watch was a letter, not old and yellowed, but recent. Eleanor recognized her own handwriting on the envelope. It was the acceptance letter she'd sent Jacob agreeing to marry him. But underneath that was another envelope, addressed to her in Thomas's familiar script. With shaking hands, Eleanor opened Thomas's letter. The paper was worn, creased from being carried, and dated nearly 2 weeks before his death. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, and she had to stop, pressing her hand to her mouth to contain the sob that rose in her throat. She read on, tears streaming down her face. "If you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I'm no longer with you. I pray you never have to read these words. But I've been having dark feelings lately about the logging work, about the instability of the trees we're cutting. Better to be prepared than to leave you unprepared. By now, you'll have met Jacob Crane, or at least you should have. I met him 6 months ago when I was working the high timber. There was a flash flood in the creek, sudden and violent, and I would have been swept away if not for Jacob. He appeared out of nowhere, pulled me from the water, and saved my life without asking for anything in return. We talked for a long while after, and I learned he's been alone in these mountains for years, running from something in his past, though he didn't say what. I saw in him a good man struggling with isolation, with self-imposed exile. And I saw someone strong enough, capable enough to protect what matters. Eleanor, if I'm gone, I need you to know you're not alone. Before I left Jacob that day, I asked him for a promise. I asked him to watch over you if anything happened to me, to make sure you weren't taken advantage of, that your claim stayed yours, that you had someone to turn to if the vultures started circling. He gave me his word. And from what I know of him, his word is solid. I don't know what arrangement you'll come to with him. Maybe marriage, maybe just protection from a distance. Whatever it is, please know that I trust him. I trust him with what matters most in this world, your safety, your future, your happiness. Don't grieve too long for me, my love. I want you to live. I want you to find joy again, even if it's with someone else. You have so much life ahead of you, so much love still to give. Don't lock it away because I'm gone. Jacob Crane is a better man than he believes himself to be. If he's the one standing beside you now, trust him, let him help. And maybe, if you're lucky, let him love you the way I did, completely, respectfully, with everything he has. You will always be the greatest gift of my life. Forever yours, Thomas." Eleanor sat on the floor, the letter clutched in her hands, weeping openly. Everything she thought she understood about her marriage to Jacob shifted and rearranged itself. The proposal hadn't been spontaneous generosity, it had been a promise kept. Jacob had married her out of obligation to a dead man. But then she thought of the pine ring, carved from Thomas's timber. She thought of the wildflowers, the gentle courtesies, the way Jacob had created space for her grief while slowly, carefully offering companionship. If it had been only obligation, would he have done those things? Or had something genuine grown from the roots of that promise? Eleanor heard Jacob return, stomping snow from his boots on the porch. She quickly wiped her face and stood, tucking the letter into her apron pocket. She needed time to process this, to understand what it meant. She walked out of the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Jacob looked up from removing his coat. His smile faded instantly when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" "I found Thomas's letter," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The one explaining your promise to him. And his watch. They were in my bedside table." All the color drained from Jacob's face. He stood frozen, his coat half removed, looking like a man who'd just been sentenced. "Eleanor, You married me because Thomas asked you to. It wasn't a question." Jacob hung his coat slowly, buying time. "That's how it started, yes." "How it started?" Eleanor's voice rose, despite her attempt at control. "So, what is this then? What have these months been? Just you fulfilling an obligation? Keeping a promise to a dead man?" "No." Jacob moved toward her, then stopped, seeming to understand she needed space. "At first, yes. I promised Thomas I'd watch over you. When I heard about the judge's deadline, about you losing everything, I thought, I thought marriage was the best way to honor that promise, to protect you legally, completely. And the ring? Eleanor touched the carved band on her finger. Was that just a clever way to make me grateful? To make me feel like you understood? The ring was because I did understand. Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. Because by the time we were standing in that church, it wasn't just obligation anymore. It was... He stopped, struggling with words. You'd become real to me, Eleanor. Not just a promise to keep, but a person I wanted to know. Someone I wanted to protect, yes, but also someone I wanted to spend time with. To learn from. To what? To love, Jacob said simply. I was already falling in love with you when I carved that ring. I was terrified you'd see through me, that you'd realize I wasn't doing this purely out of charity or honor, but because I wanted you in my life for my own selfish reasons. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. You love me? I do. Jacob didn't look away, didn't try to soften it. I know it's not what you signed up for. I know you married me for protection, not affection. But these months with you, watching you grieve, watching you slowly come back to life, watching you find beauty in the snow, I've fallen completely. And if that makes things harder for you, I'm sorry. But I won't lie about it anymore. Eleanor felt like she couldn't breathe. Everything was too much, too fast. The letter from Thomas, giving his blessing. Jacob's confession. Her own confused feelings that she hadn't wanted to examine too closely because examining them felt like betrayal. I need air, she said abruptly, and fled. She grabbed her coat and pushed out into the December cold, not caring that she wore only house slippers, not caring that the snow was knee-deep. She stumbled away from the cabin into the white silence of the forest, her breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with the altitude. Jacob didn't follow, and she was grateful for that. She needed to think, to process, to understand what she felt beneath the shock and confusion. She thought about Thomas's letter, about his blessing, about his hope that she would live and love again. She thought about Jacob's confession, about the vulnerability in his voice when he'd said the word love. She thought about her own heart, which had been so carefully guarded, so determined to remain loyal to a dead man. And she realized, with a clarity that was both frightening and liberating, that she'd been falling too. Slowly, carefully, fighting it every step of the way, but falling nonetheless. Jacob's quiet strength, his hidden depths, his capacity for tenderness, these things had worked their way past her defenses without her realizing it. But acknowledging that felt like stepping off a cliff, felt like letting go of Thomas completely. And Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready for that leap, no matter how much her heart might be urging her toward it. Eleanor stayed outside until her feet went numb and her fingers ached with cold. When she finally returned to the cabin, Jacob was at the table. Thomas's letter spread before him. He looked up when she entered, his face drawn with worry and something that might have been shame. I should have told you, he said before she could speak. From the beginning I should have been honest about the promise. I thought it would be easier if you didn't know. That you could believe the marriage was simpler than it was. Eleanor removed her coat with stiff fingers. Thomas knew you 5 months before he died. You saved his life. I did, and he asked you to watch over me if anything happened. He did. Jacob's hands were clenched on the table. He talked about you constantly that day, after the flood, how you'd met, how he'd known immediately you were meant to be together, how you'd given up a comfortable life back east to come to the frontier with him. He loved you so much, Eleanor. It radiated from him. Eleanor sat across from him, her legs weak. What did he say, exactly, when he asked you to promise? Jacob was quiet for a moment, remembering. He said, I've got a bad feeling about these trees we're cutting. The foreman's pushing too hard, taking risks that aren't wise. If something happens to me, there's a man in town, Judge Wakefield, who'll try to take advantage of my wife. She's strong, but she'll be vulnerable. I need to know someone will stand between her and the wolves. Then he looked me straight in the eye and asked if I'd give my word to protect you, to make sure you weren't alone. Tears burned Eleanor's eyes. That was so like Thomas worrying about her even when facing his own danger. And you said yes. I did. I told him I'd watch over you, whatever that meant, whatever you needed. Jacob's voice dropped. I didn't expect to care about you beyond that promise. I thought it would be simple duty. But Eleanor, from the moment I met you at the general store, from the moment I saw your grief and your strength fighting each other, you weren't simple. You were real and complicated and brave in ways I hadn't expected. Eleanor touched the letter, Thomas's handwriting blurring through her tears. He gave us his blessing. He wanted me to live, to love again. Maybe even to love you. I know I don't deserve it, Jacob said quietly. I know I'm not what you would have chosen if circumstances were different. But I want you to know everything I've felt for you has been real. Not obligation, not pity. Real. They sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling, snow tapping against the windows. Finally, Eleanor spoke. I need time. To understand what I feel, to make peace with Thomas's memory and with the idea of moving forward. Can you give me that? As much as you need? Jacob promised. Nothing changes. We go on as we have been, and you tell me when, if you're ready for something different. The days that followed were strange and tender. They continued their routines, meals together, evening reading, shared work. But there was an awareness now, a recognition of feelings that had been unnamed. Eleanor caught herself watching Jacob more closely, noticing the way he moved, the sound of his voice, the careful way he handled fragile things. She also spent time with Thomas's letter, reading it over and over until she had it memorized. His words were a gift, permission to live, to love, to move forward without guilt. But permission didn't make it easy. One evening, Sarah McKenna's nephew arrived on snowshoes with a letter from town. Sarah wrote that Judge Wakefield had been quietly removed from his position. There were questions about his financial dealings, about claims he'd acquired through questionable means. The territorial government was investigating. Eleanor's original homestead, it seemed, was being reviewed among the potentially fraudulent transactions. This is good news, Jacob said, reading over her shoulder. Means your land might come back to you fully, without any legal clouds. Our land, Eleanor corrected softly. You paid the debts. You married me to protect the claim. It's as much yours as mine now. Jacob looked at her carefully. I didn't marry you for the land. I know. Eleanor met his eyes. But it's still ours. Whatever happens between us, whatever this becomes, that doesn't change. Winter deepened. Christmas came, and Eleanor and Jacob marked it quietly with a special meal and gifts they'd made for each other. Eleanor had knitted Jacob a warm scarf from wool she'd purchased in town before. The snow. Jacob gave her a carved box, beautiful and delicate, lined with velvet he must have traded for. Inside was a single item, a ring carved from pine, smaller than Eleanor's, clearly meant for a man's hand. I made it weeks ago, Jacob admitted. Before the letter, before you knew about the promise, I hoped that maybe someday you'd want me to wear one too, that this could become a real marriage, not just on paper. Eleanor held the ring, turning it in the firelight. It matched hers perfectly, clearly carved as a pair. You've been hoping for a long time. Since the day I carved yours, Jacob confirmed. Maybe even before that. Eleanor set the ring carefully back in the box. I'm not ready yet, she said gently. But Jacob, I'm getting closer. Does that count for something? The expression on his face was answer enough. It counts for everything. January arrived with blizzards that buried the cabin to the windows. They were truly trapped now, dependent entirely on each other. Eleanor found she didn't mind. The isolation felt less like imprisonment and more like sanctuary, a space where she could work through her feelings without the pressure of outside judgment. One night, unable to sleep, Eleanor climbed down from the bedroom to find Jacob sitting by the fire. He looked up, startled. "Everything all right?" "Couldn't sleep." Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter. "Mind if I sit with you?" "Never." Jacob moved to make room for her in the second chair. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Tell me about Philadelphia. About who you were before you came here." Jacob's surprise showed clearly. She'd never asked about his past before, had accepted his privacy as he'd accepted her grief. "I was a teacher," he said slowly. "Like my mother, taught literature and philosophy at a boys' school. What happened? I fell in love with someone inappropriate, the headmaster's daughter. We were discreet, or thought we were. When her father found out, he gave me a choice: leave quietly or face charges of impropriety that would destroy my reputation and my mother's memory. I left." Jacob's hands were clasped tight. "Came west to disappear, found these mountains and thought I'd found peace. But peace and happiness aren't the same thing. Took me 5 years to learn that." "Do you regret leaving?" "No. That life would have killed something in me eventually. But I regret the isolation. I regret thinking that solitude was the same as independence, that not needing people made me strong." He looked at Eleanor directly. "You've taught me that real strength is letting yourself need someone, letting yourself care even when it's risky." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm scared, Jacob. Scared of loving someone again and losing them. Scared of dishonoring Thomas's memory. Scared of admitting how much I've come to care for you." "Care for me?" Jacob's voice was barely audible. "Yes." Eleanor looked at her hands, at the pine ring that had become as familiar as her own skin. "I didn't want to. I fought it. But somewhere between the coffee you leave warming for me and the way you read Dickens and the patience you've shown with my grief, I started caring. And it terrifies me." Jacob reached across the space between their chairs and gently took her hand. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact since their wedding day. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. Being scared doesn't mean you're not ready. Sometimes being scared just means something matters enough to be scary. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, then up at Jacob's face. In the firelight, his features were softened, the hard edges of his solitude worn smooth by months of companionship. She thought of Thomas's letter, his blessing, his hope that she would find joy again. She thought of her own heart, which had been frozen at 2:30 for so long but was slowly, painfully, learning to keep time again. "I'm not ready to put your ring on your finger," she said quietly. "Not yet. But Jacob, I'm ready to try. To let myself feel this without guilt. To see where it goes." The hope that flooded Jacob's face was almost too much to witness. "That's more than I expected. More than I deserve." "You deserve more than you think," Eleanor said. She squeezed his hand once, then stood. "Good night, Jacob." "Good night, Eleanor." She climbed back to the bedroom, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Behind her, Jacob sat by the fire, holding the hand she'd touched as if it were something precious. And perhaps it was the first real touch of affection she'd offered, the first crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the cabin, something was thawing. Spring was still months away in the mountains, but in the space between Eleanor and Jacob, warmth was beginning to grow. They traveled to Pine Ridge. 3 days later, taking the newly passable road with spring sunshine warming their shoulders. Eleanor sat close to Jacob on the wagon bench, no longer maintaining the careful distance she'd kept on their wedding day. His arm was around her, and she leaned into his warmth without hesitation or shame. The town had changed in their absence, or perhaps Eleanor had changed and simply saw it differently. The buildings looked smaller, less significant. The stares of curious townspeople no longer carried the weight they once had. She was Eleanor Crane now, truly and completely, and she'd stopped caring what anyone thought about how she'd arrived at that name. They went first to Sarah McKenna's house. Sarah opened the door and immediately pulled Eleanor into a fierce embrace. "Look at you," she said, holding Eleanor at arm's length. "You're glowing." "Something's changed." "Everything's changed," Eleanor said, smiling. "Sarah, I'd like you to know my husband, not my arrangement or my convenience, but my husband, Jacob Crane." Sarah turned her shrewd gaze on Jacob, who stood respectfully behind Eleanor. After a long moment, she nodded with satisfaction. "I see it. Good. You've both stopped being afraid." She gestured them inside. "Come in and tell me everything." Over coffee in Sarah's warm kitchen, they shared the story, the discovery of Thomas's letter, Jacob's confession, the long winter of Eleanor learning to let herself love again. Sarah listened with the wisdom of someone who'd walked similar paths, who understood that healing rarely followed straight lines. "Thomas was a good man," Sarah said finally. "He would be glad to know you found happiness again, especially with someone worthy of it." She looked at Jacob directly. "You are worthy of it, young man. Don't forget that." From Sarah's house, they walked to the church. Reverend Dale was in the small office attached to the chapel, working on Sunday's sermon. He looked up when they entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Crane, I wondered if I might see you when the snow cleared." He set down his pen. "What brings you to town?" "We'd like to renew our vows," Eleanor said, taking Jacob's hand. "The first ceremony was about survival and obligation. We want this one to be about love and choice." Understanding dawned in the Reverend's eyes. "Ah, I see. And you want witnesses this time? A true celebration?" "We do," Jacob confirmed. "Whatever Eleanor wants, however she wants it done." They planned it for the following Saturday, giving time for word to spread and for people to prepare. Sarah immediately took charge of organizing a proper reception at her house afterward. "You may not want fanfare," she said firmly, "but this town needs to see that good things can come from hard circumstances. That love can grow even in difficult soil." The week passed in a flurry of activity. Eleanor and Jacob stayed at the homestead cabin, and Eleanor was struck by how different it felt. The memories of Thomas were still there. She could still see him at the stove, hear his laugh in the corners, but they no longer hurt with the same sharp intensity. Instead, they felt like gentle company, like Thomas himself was glad to see her moving forward. Jacob spent the week making repairs, fixing all the things Eleanor had mentioned months ago, the leaking roof, the sticking door, the loose porch board. "This place should be sound," he said. "We'll use it in summers, when the mountain gets too hot. Split our time between both places." Saturday arrived clear and bright, the kind of spring day that promised warmth and renewal. Eleanor wore a new dress, not white, but a soft blue that Sarah had helped her sew. She wore the pine ring Jacob had carved, and in her pocket she carried Thomas's pocket watch, not as a weight of grief, but as a blessing from the past on her future. The church was fuller this time. Sarah had spread the word, and people came, some out of curiosity, some out of genuine happiness for Eleanor's second chance. Even a few who'd been skeptical of the original marriage came to witness what everyone could see was real love. Jacob wore his suit again, but this time with confidence instead of awkward formality. When Eleanor walked down the aisle toward him, his face held nothing back. Pure love, pure joy, pure gratitude that she'd chosen him. This time, when Reverend Dale spoke about partnership and devotion, the words rang true. This time, when they exchanged vows, Eleanor's voice was strong and certain. This time, when Jacob was invited to kiss his bride, he did so thoroughly, tenderly, publicly claiming her in a way that left no doubt about the nature of their union. "I present to you," Reverend Dale said with a smile, "Mr. and Mrs. Jacob Crane, by love, by choice, and by the grace of God." The small congregation applauded. Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Eleanor, looking up at her, "Husband, truly." Her husband now felt Thomas's blessing wash over her like sunlight. She'd been given a second chance at love, and she'd had the courage to take it. That, she thought, was the best way to honor everything Thomas had wanted for her to live fully, to love deeply, and to never stop believing in the possibility of joy. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the garden behind the homestead cabin, her hands deep in warm earth, planting seeds for the late summer harvest. The garden had been Jacob's idea, a way to honor both properties, to make the homestead a living, productive place again, rather than just a memorial to what had been. They'd fallen into a rhythm, splitting their time between the mountain cabin and the valley homestead. Summers they spent here, where the garden could thrive, and Eleanor could maintain the connections she'd built in Pine Ridge. Winters they retreated to the mountain, to the isolation and peace that suited them both. It was a good life, balanced between community and solitude, past and present. Eleanor pressed seeds into the soil, marking each row carefully. Tomatoes, beans, squash, carrots, all the things Thomas had planted, but now, with Jacob's help and planning, the garden was larger this year, ambitious enough to provide for trade as well as their own needs. Jacob had built proper raised beds and a better irrigation system. Everything Thomas had started, Jacob was helping her expand and improve. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the familiar creak and jingle that meant Jacob returning from town. He'd gone to deliver furs and pick up supplies, leaving Eleanor alone for the day to work the garden. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, and smiled as he came around the cabin. "How was town?" she called. "Busy. Spring always brings folks out." Jacob climbed down from the wagon and walked to where Eleanor stood among the young plants. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Sarah sends her love. And this." He handed Eleanor a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a delicately knitted baby blanket, soft yellow wool worked in an intricate pattern. Eleanor's breath caught as understanding dawned. "She knows?" Eleanor touched her still flat stomach, where new life was just beginning to make itself known. "Sarah knows everything," Jacob said with a smile. "Claims she could tell by the way you moved at church last week. Something about how women carry themselves when they're expecting." He placed his hand over Eleanor's, both of them cradling the secret they'd been keeping for a few weeks. "She's right, isn't she?" "She's right." Eleanor looked up at her husband, seeing the wonder and slight fear in his eyes. "Are you ready to be a father?" "I don't know," Jacob admitted honestly. "But I'm ready to try, ready to build this family with you." They stood together in the garden, surrounded by growing things, holding the promise of their future between them. Eleanor thought of Thomas, of the children they'd planned to have that would never be. For a moment, sadness touched her, not for what she had now, but for what Thomas had missed. "He would have been a wonderful father," she said quietly. Jacob understood immediately. "He would have, and Eleanor will make sure our child knows about him, about his courage, his dreams, his love for you. Thomas will be part of this family, part of our story."